There is a version of your life that other people have already written for you. They didn't ask. They didn't have to. They love you. And somehow, that felt like reason enough. This is the story of a man who spent the first half of his life living that version, and the second half, the painful, costly, magnificent second half, finally living his own. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and what happened between those two halves will stay with you long after this video ends. The 18th century had rules, strict, immovable ones. If you were born into a family of court musicians, you were a servant with a gift. You composed when commanded. You performed when summoned. You did not confuse your talent with your freedom, because freedom was simply not on offer. Leopold Mozart understood this world perfectly. He was a violinist in the service of the Archbishop of Salzburg. Disciplined, intelligent, deeply respected. He had written one of the most celebrated treatises on violin technique in all of Europe. He was talented enough to dream, but not free enough to do anything about it. So the dream stayed buried, until the day his son was born. By age 3, little Wolfgang was climbing onto the piano bench beside his older sister Nannerl. Not to bang the keys, but to listen, to search, to understand. By 5, he was composing original pieces. By 6, he was performing for royalty. Leopold watched all of this unfold and felt something shift deep inside him. Not just pride, something more complicated than pride. This boy was extraordinary, and Leopold, the man who had quietly buried his own ambitions, immediately began to decide what that extraordinary gift was going to be used for. That is where this story really begins. Not with the music, with the father who heard the music and saw in it everything he had ever wanted for himself. Leopold pulled both children out of their quiet Salzburg life and took them on the road across Europe. 3 years, dozens of cities, courts, palaces and concert halls, from Munich to London. Wolfgang performed for Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna. He played blindfolded to prove the gift was real. He improvised on themes shouted from the crowd. He identified notes played behind his back. Every test passed, every expectation shattered. The world went wild for him, and for a time it felt like magic. But here is what no one said out loud. The world was not applauding Wolfgang. Not really. It was applauding the spectacle of him, the impossibility of a 6-year-old doing something that grown men could not. A child prodigy is thrilling, right up until the child grows up. And when that happens, the world moves on without a word of apology. Leopold saw this, and instead of protecting his son from it, he leaned in. Because the money was real, the doors being opened were real, and somewhere inside him, this had quietly stopped being just about Wolfgang. The prestigious court appointment that Leopold had engineered the whole tour toward never came. Wolfgang returned home and took up a position as court musician for Archbishop Colloredo. Imperious, aristocratic, a man who viewed his musicians the way a factory owner views his machines. Useful, replaceable, expected to produce and make no demands. Wolfgang hated every day of it. He had his own vision. Operas, drama, music that said something real about being human. Colloredo wanted background pieces for dinner parties, and Leopold pressed from the other direction. Every letter was a careful ledger of sacrifices made, money spent, opportunities engineered. The message beneath every line was the same. You owe me. Never written that bluntly, never had to be. The weight of it was everywhere. In every reminder of the years Leopold had devoted, every expense he had carried, every door he had opened. And Wolfgang felt it. He was not ungrateful. He knew exactly what his father had given him, and that knowledge sat on his chest like a stone. Because it meant that to choose himself was to betray the man who had built him. To want something different was to say that all of Leopold's sacrifice had been for nothing. This is the trap that love and control build together. They make your freedom feel like cruelty. They make choosing yourself feel like abandonment. And for years, long, slow, grinding years, it worked on Mozart completely. Leopold finally agreed to let Wolfgang travel, not out of generosity, out of strategy. Go to Paris, find a prestigious position, send money home, do what you were built for. On the way in Mannheim, Wolfgang fell in love with a young soprano named Aloysia Weber. He wrote to his father about her with the barely contained joy of a man who has just discovered that life can feel like this. Leopold's response was precise and devastating. He reminded Wolfgang of his responsibilities, of the family waiting, of the money already spent. He turned gratitude into an instruction. Move on. And Wolfgang, as he always did, obeyed. He traveled on to Paris. The city received him with something worse than rejection: indifference. He was no longer a miracle child. He was just another talented musician in a city full of them. The commissions trickled. The positions offered were beneath him. He refused them, which left him more desperate and more isolated. And then his mother, who had accompanied him on the journey, got sick. A fever, then an infection, then something worse. Wolfgang wrote home in careful, staged increments, gently preparing his father for what was coming, even in his own grief, because he already knew. He was managing Leopold's feelings, softening the blow, protecting the man who had controlled his whole life from the shock of one bad day. She died on July 3, 1778. Wolfgang was alone in a foreign city, and the one person who had ever loved him without conditions was gone. He returned to Salzburg broken, stepped back into his position, sat at the keyboard every day and played, correctly and competently, music that meant nothing to him. Inside, quietly, he was disappearing. Mozart was in Vienna with the Archbishop's household, and something in the city woke him up. He performed at private concerts and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely heard, not as a spectacle, not as a servant, as an artist. The contrast with Salzburg was unbearable. He requested a formal dismissal from the Archbishop's service. Colloredo granted it with contempt. His chief steward, Count Arco, delivered the final message by physically kicking Mozart out of the room. A literal boot to the backside of the greatest composer alive. Mozart was furious, but underneath the fury was something he had not felt in years. Relief, pure, terrifying relief. The cage door was open. He wrote his father a long, careful, loving letter. He explained his reasoning. He asked for Leopold's blessing. He did not ask for permission. Leopold's response came like a wall. Fury, every sacrifice recalled, every debt restated. He withheld his blessing completely and waited for Wolfgang to come home. Wolfgang did not come home. He stayed in Vienna. He found lodgings with the Weber family, the same family whose daughter Aloysia he had once loved in Mannheim. Aloysia had married someone else by then, but her younger sister Constanza was there. Warm, uncomplicated, genuinely fond of this brilliant and baffling man who had turned up in their house. Wolfgang married her in December 1782. He did not ask his father's permission. He told him after the decision was already made. For the first time in his life, Wolfgang Mozart is free. And the music that came out of that freedom, the Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte, the Magic Flute, the final 3 symphonies, the piano concertos, is some of the most extraordinary work any human being has ever produced. He was composing with the urgency of a man who had waited too long and knew it. But let us not skip past what the freedom cost him, because Leopold never forgave it. He visited Vienna only once. In 1785, 3 years into Wolfgang's marriage, he stayed for a few weeks. He heard his son's music performed. He met Constanza. He watched Wolfgang move through a world he had built entirely without Leopold's guidance or approval, and then he went back to Salzburg. The letters between them after that visit grew sparser, shorter, the warmth still there in places but underneath it. A distance that neither man knew how to close. Too much had been said, too much had been left unsaid. The father who had shaped every year of Wolfgang's early life now felt like a stranger standing on the other side of a river, watching from a bank he could not cross. Leopold died in May 1787. He and Wolfgang had not seen each other since that visit 2 years earlier. Wolfgang received the news in Vienna, and what followed was something he had not expected. Not relief, not anger, but a grief that went deeper than he knew how to explain. Because the reconciliation he had always told himself was still possible. The conversation where his father finally understood, where they finally said the things they had never been able to say, was now never going to happen. That door had closed, permanently, and Wolfgang would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of everything left unresolved between them. He never spoke about his father's death much. He didn't need to. The guilt was in the silences, in the way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence in letters and changed the subject, in the music that grew darker and more searching in the years that followed, as if he were trying to say in notes what he had never managed to say in words. He had chosen himself. He had paid for it, and the cost was not just the estrangement. It was knowing that the man who had built him died without ever fully understanding the man he had become. Some wounds do not heal. They just become part of who you are. And Wolfgang carried this one, quietly, heavily, for the rest of his life. I want you to sit with this for a moment before I say anything else. Because if you have ever loved someone who needed you to be something specific, a parent, a partner, a community that shaped you, then some part of this story already lives inside you. You have felt that weight, that particular guilt of wanting something different from what you were given, that fear that choosing yourself is the same as abandoning the people who sacrificed for you. Mozart felt it too. He felt it every day, and he was one of the most gifted human beings who ever lived. And it still took him 25 years to act on it. So if it is taking you time, that is not weakness. That is how deep these forces run. But here is what his life is trying to tell you. The love that comes with conditions is still love. But it is not a blueprint you are required to follow. Leopold genuinely loved his son. The sacrifices were real. But he could not separate Wolfgang from his own unfulfilled ambitions, and so his love became a cage neither of them could name out loud. You can honor someone's sacrifice without surrendering your identity to their vision of who you should be. Those are two different things, and the sooner you learn to tell them apart, the less of your life you will spend living someone else's version of it. Approval seeking does not feel like self-betrayal. That is what makes it so dangerous. It feels like responsibility, like being grateful, like being a good son, a good daughter, a good person. You adapt, you moderate. You learn which parts of yourself are safe to show and which need to stay quiet. And slowly, without ever making a single dramatic decision, you disappear. Mozart almost let that happen to him. The quiet years in Salzburg, playing correct and competent music that meant nothing. That was a man fading. Do not let that be you. And then there is the cost. Choosing your purpose over approval is not a clean or comfortable decision. It costs something real. For Mozart, it cost him his father's full blessing, and ultimately the chance to ever truly make things right between them. That grief was permanent. He carried it until the end. But here is the other side of that truth. The music he made in his free years. The work that came out of a man finally, fully being himself, has outlasted every king, every archbishop, every aristocrat who ever controlled or dismissed him. The approval fades. The work remains. So ask yourself, honestly, not rhetorically, what are you keeping quiet right now because someone you love needs you to be something more manageable? What would you build? What would you become? What would you finally allow yourself to be? If you stopped measuring your life by whether the people who shaped you are satisfied with it. Mozart had the answer in him from the very beginning. It just took a cage, a broken tour, a mother's death, a literal kick out of a room, and the permanent loss of his father's understanding for him to finally stop asking for permission to use it. You do not have to wait that long.